Hello, everybody. It's good to have you back here with us. Today we have special guest, Reverend Dr. Lawrence J. And I have the permission to call you Larry, right? Is that right?
Yes, you do. You're a friend, and so friends call me Larry, but the professional name is the Reverend Doctor.
All right, Reverend
Oh,
Doctor.
please. And so,
Good to have Larry here with us. He's a spiritual director and also director of Rolling Ridge in North Andover in Massachusetts. So I just met him not too long ago. I've always been wanting to meet you and talk to you about your role and your ministry and because I did some research and I was always looking for a place to go for my personal retreat, and Rolling Ridge always popped up in my research. So I got to visit that place and I really loved that. And thank you again for taking my invitation and being available today.
well, it's good. I look forward to having conversations about spiritual direction. Rolling Ridge focuses on what we call contemplative spirituality, and we do a lot of work with spiritual directors in terms of our training, in terms of continuing resourcing and supporting, and so anything that we can do to continue to nurture the spiritual life of spiritual directors is something that it's a privilege to be a part of.
So Larry, before you became the director there, as well as before you became a spiritual director, what sort of ministry were you part of before? What was your journey like?
And so, as you know, journeys are never always a straight line. Lots of moving back and forth all over the place. But I grew up in a mainline Protestant church. Grew up in American and Baptist home. My parents both actually met at the church, and there's all sorts of stories about them meeting other people and dating other people that were part of their fellowship group at the time. And But it was a church out in San Francisco. So my parents met and married. I was basically born right into the nursery. My mother was a kindergarten teacher, and she taught kindergarten for decades and for 60, 70 years, kind of a thing. And so I basically kind of grew up in the church, and being the good Christian boy that I was at the time, I kind of felt like there was a leaning towards ministry very early on in my life. And I eventually went off to college, felt a call to ministry, and eventually kind of found my way into campus ministry. I eventually went on to seminary, I served as a youth and young adult pastor, went into church planting ministry, and then while in the midst of church planting, felt a call to be able to move. And so I tell people I left the concrete jungle of San Francisco and moved to the redwood forest of Santa Cruz and never really looked back. And so for the last 20 years, I've been in camping and retreat ministry in the redwoods for about 10 years. And just a little over 9 years ago, I made the big jump from California out to Massachusetts, serving at Rolling Ridge Retreat and Conference Center, where I've been since 2017. So that's just kind of the bird's eye view of kind of where I've been.
Yeah, thank you. Wow. So take us back to the first time when you ran into spiritual direction. How did it show up in your life? And, what made you think, I want more of this?
I grew up within, American Baptist tradition. American Baptists, like many mainline Protestants, are not necessarily the most contemplative of folks, but there was always this idea of having of one-on-one kind of things, and especially as I graduated and moved from a youth ministry and moved into college, I kind of swung from more of a mainline Protestant stream, and I kind of found myself in campus ministry, where I kind of took on more of an evangelical kind of theological perspective and persona. And so at that time, one-on-one discipleship was a big part of the ministries that I was involved with. I was involved with an Asian American Christian fellowship group, as well as the Navigators, and a lot of that was focusing in on one-on-one discipleship. And so the idea of companioning someone on the spiritual journey was kind of inbred in very early on, as I was kind of getting my feet wet in ministry. And so I kind of swung into that evangelical stream in the early years of my ministry. I actually went to a Southern Baptist seminary where I received my Master's of Divinity, and was very much involved with more of an evangelical, a little bit more of a conservative thread in terms of how I was ministering and understanding what it meant for me to follow God and to be a Christ follower. And so this idea of one-on-one discipleship was very much focusing in on how do you go follow Jesus? How are you faithful to Scripture? How are you living your life in a way that God is pleasing to God? And so, but it was very much found in that one-on-one kind of experience. As I began to kind of grow in my own experience of God, I began to kind of recognize that there was more to my faith than this evangelical thread that I kind of had moved into. And so I found myself moving into more of a mystical, contemplative thread, really found in more Catholic mysticism. And so I kind of swung away from more evangelical space and kind of swung out towards more contemplative and mystical theology and spirituality in the Catholic tradition. I decided to leave pastoral ministry around that time, and it was around that time that I also discovered the Franciscans and kind of lived into more of a Franciscan identity as I kind of found myself at the Franciscan School of Theology and kind of re understanding my Master's of Divinity with a Master's of Theology that really focused in on shifting how I understand God, how I see Scripture, and how I understand what it means to follow Jesus in terms of who I am and how God has called me to. And so it was in the midst of this shift from more of an evangelical Southern Baptist thing, swinging all the way over to more of a Catholic Franciscan kind of a thread that I found myself experiencing spiritual direction. Part of what I was doing at a certain period of time, I was in San Francisco at the time, as I think I alluded to, but I found myself taking some summer classes at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley up on Holy Hill, and I had been doing some campus ministry work in Berkeley, so I was familiar with that. And but it was through my time at the Graduate Theological Union that I found out about spiritual direction. There was an intro to spiritual direction class, which sounded like this one-on-one discipleship stuff that I was doing in my evangelical world. And so I remember taking this, I remember taking the intro to spiritual direction class in Mud Hall over at the Pacific School of Religion, and wanting to kind of start getting experience, so to speak, in spiritual direction. I remember shopping around trying to find a spiritual director, and my first spiritual director was actually a retreat director down in the southern part of down in the South Bay in the San Jose area. I look back, I kind of go, it's like, how interesting that my first spiritual director was a retreat center director. And here I am as a spiritual director in a retreat center. God
Yeah.
has a sense of humor all the way around. And so,
Yeah.
and, uh,
What
and
year
so
was
that's,
that? If you don't mind me asking, just so that we
it was
can locate
probably
you.
it was probably in the mid 1990s that this was all taking
1990s.
place.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Right.
that's kind of where I was kind of getting my feet wet in some of this, and so we're talking about the mid 1990s, and as things began to kind of move back and forth in regards to kind of where I was at, I then kind of moved. I fell away from spiritual direction for a little while, kind of came back to it, and as I began to kind of get more involved at the Franciscan school, I also found a former Franciscan friar who has been my spiritual director now for going on 20 years. And I just met with him yesterday, and it's good to be able to have someone that's companioned me for a good chunk of my journey. But that's the long answer to
Yeah.
your question.
Yeah,
So.
thank you for that journey, the overview of your journey. But I'm now curious about what it was that got your attention to want to become a spiritual director. If you could kind of speak more into your personal take on like what was it about spiritual direction that really made you appreciate this and want to have more of this?
And so, as I mentioned, through the evangelical tradition in this one-on-one discipleship, there was a heavy emphasis on what is it that you believe as a follower of Jesus.
Hmm.
And while that worked as I was trying to kind of found a little bit more grounding in terms of what do I believe, growing up in more of a progressive mainline Protestant denomination, there wasn't necessarily that focus as much as I think that I had wanted, because I was on a spiritual journey. I found myself going away to college, finding a more of evangelical experience, wanting to understand, well, what is the Bible? Who is Jesus? What does all this fit? How does all this fit in? And it was all very much focusing on, what the navigators called the design for discipleship, the things that you need to know to follow
Right.
Jesus. But as
Hmm.
I began to kind of move in my own ministry and as I began to work in youth ministry, especially recognizing that, following Jesus is not just about something that's up here. It's
Yeah.
more about something that goes on here. And as much as you try to do that within Sunday school classes
Here meaning
and
the
Bible
heart.
study, yeah, me here in the
Yeah. So
heart.
for
Um,
people who are just listening, so I wanted to.
Oh no, that's
Okay.
okay. And so it's moving from the head into the heart.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
so that's where I think that as I began to work in a ministry, especially with young people, recognizing that for some people, they're just not wired as head people. They really want to have that experience of what it means to be touched by God and to experience the depth of God's love in their life. And I think that really of how do you companion someone not just from the head space to the heart space to the soul space is really kind of one of the things that kind of helped me be attracted to this idea of spiritual direction because it's recognizing that one size does not fit all. And so to be able to have someone who is able to listen into how God is stirring within one's heart and how to be able to process that through in a safe and sacred space, I think is something that was attractive to me. And so I found myself curious about how all that needed to kind of live itself out in my ministry. And so, but it wasn't really until later on after as I began to kind of move into new spaces here in Massachusetts, that I really began to move forward with more training in spiritual direction. As I mentioned, I went from pastoral ministry to camping and retreat ministry. And a big part of the camping and retreat ministry was more guest services, camp operations, and so forth. And while there were programming aspects in regards to retreat leadership and whatnot. It really was not until I came out here to Massachusetts at Rolling Ridge that I began to kind of have a little bit more space in my life and in my schedule to be able to really officially kind of go through spiritual direction training. And with that, to be able to kind of begin the whole process of companioning people as well. In many ways, I kind of fell into spiritual direction on the back end because of my pastoral ministry experience. Even though I wasn't trained as a spiritual director, because I was in pastoral ministry for almost 10 years, there was that sense of pastoral counseling that kind of comes in, that comes into play in regards to simply knowing how to listen to someone's journey and how to walk alongside them. And so for me, the transition from this idea of one-on-one discipleship into pastoral counseling into spiritual direction was a somewhat natural transition, but the need to really kind of be recognized and to be trained as a spiritual director came after I landed here at Rolling Ridge. I was contacted by the Boston University School of Theology, the spiritual formation coordinator. They were looking for spiritual directors to have group spiritual direction for some of their students. And I remember telling the person, it's like, I'm not a trained spiritual director. And the person goes, it's like, well, that's okay. Rolling Ridge is known for that. I think you're going to be fine. And so I kind of fell into the back end. So I started doing some group spiritual direction without really officially being trained. And so I found myself kind of backing into this idea of, okay, I'm doing this. I'm able to do it naturally because of the skill set that I have, but to be able to go through some training will allow me to be more effective all the way around. And so there was a bit of imposter syndrome at the very beginning, but I was able to kind of get my training caught up with my skills, and I now find myself kind of living into a very healthy rhythm, recognizing that a good part of spiritual direction is about listening, and so
Yeah.
one-on-one discipleship pastoral counseling and spiritual direction are really all about learning to listen, and it's companioning in similar ways, but with slightly different
Yeah.
foci, I think.
Thank you. So, because you have experience coming from pastoral ministry to discipleship, and then in the back end, you kind of enter into spiritual direction or becoming a spiritual director, that you might be able to kind of articulate the difference a little bit. Because you mentioned about, we live in the headspace a lot, and then you talked about moving to the heart. Some folks in Protestant circle might be saying, like, what is wrong with being in the head? Are we supposed to study the scripture? Are we supposed to understand the scripture? Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by going from the head to the heart?
I think it's being able to ask the hard questions in such a way that it's being able to challenge some of the things that people might grow up knowing and believing. A lot of the people that I work with find themselves as former somethings, and a big part of it is it's working through some of the PTSD that comes from some of these spaces where it's like you need to believe this, as opposed to having the freedom to be able to question this and to be able to wonder, well, what if this is not true? What if this idea of the Bible as being, inerrant? Well, what if the Bible is errant?
Mm,
There are places where you can't ask that question without kind of say it's like, how dare you? That's a sin right there. And
mm,
and there's more than enough people in our society who are leaving mainline religion, or actually even more so leaving evangelical, more conservative spaces because they've asked a question. And that's where, in some ways, discipleship is not always safe, because in many ways it's trying to conform someone to be able to believe or to do or to live a certain kind of way that is prescribed by an external authority, as opposed to trusting the fact that if we are created out of the love of God, there's an internal authority that we need to be listening to, that in many ways needs to take precedence over the external authority that is getting pushed in, that says this is the way that you need to act, be, and to believe. And so spiritual direction creates a safe and sacred space so that someone can really listen into that internal authority, whether it's called the Holy Spirit, whether it's called one's conscience, whether it's called the true self, whether it's called the universe, the divine, however it might be, and to be able to know that I don't have to use the same vocabulary that this group over here is using. I can
yeah.
begin to kind of talk about something that feels more incarnate to the fullness of who I am. And it's recognizing that as I speak from that place of authority because of God's love for me, because the divine created me out of grace, that I can listen to that. And a spiritual director is able to help someone listen more deeply into those spaces, and to be able to question and to doubt, and if necessary, to be able even to throw away all that stuff that might externally be pressed on upon someone. I remember when I left pastoral ministry and I decided to put my Bible on a shelf and not go to church. I
Mm,
had never not been to church in all those 40 years of church. But that was an important place for me to be able to recognize that, where does my faith get rooted? What do I really believe in what do I really believe about Jesus for myself? What do I really believe about the scriptures? What do I really believe about the church for myself? And I tell people that at that time I was probably very dangerous. And yet that was probably when I was able to be more fully who I am, to be able to ask those questions that oftentimes people do not feel safe in asking. And that's where I think that when it comes to discipleship, which is very much focusing on what it is that you believe, and
yeah.
pastoral counseling, which is really kind of focusing on these are the things that you need to do to be able to be, to work through whatever issue is involving, as opposed to spiritual direction, which is really recognizing that it's helping someone live into the internal authority. And that's not to say in pastoral counseling you're not necessarily doing that, but spiritual direction really focuses more on the fact that this directee, the person who is sitting in that seat, is really the authority to what God, what the divine, what the universe is doing in their life. And we're simply there to companion them, to be able to love them, to be able to know that even in the midst of whatever is going on, there is a divine embrace, even though someone cannot experience it and feel it. And so it's creating that safe, it's creating that safe space that that person can know that they are loved. Because in many ways, as much as pastors say, it's like, oh, they can meet with me, they'll know they're loved. But if you don't necessarily follow the pastor's counsel, the pastor can, often, there have been times that pastors can say, it's like, and so pastors are not always safe people, as much as they think otherwise. But
Right.
spiritual directors are places where people can be, as I said here, this is a safe space.
Hmm.
And people need that in a day and age where, they cannot feel like they can show up fully as they are, whether fully conservative and fundamental or fully progressive and I question everything that the Bible is and I don't even believe that Jesus existed, and on both sides of the extreme there is chastising if you kind of fall into either one of those. And yet
Hmm.
in spiritual direction there needs to be a space where anyone can be able to know that no matter where you are on the journey, you're always going to be on the journey. And I think that's where I think for me I've learned to be a a a good spiritual companion, a good spiritual director, because I've swung from I started someone in the middle, I swung all the way to a far right, I swung all the way into this progressive Catholic stuff, and I kind of find myself kind of falling into a little bit of a more of a middle, maybe more middle leftist kind of a space, but recognizing that I understand what Christian nationalists sometimes think, what evangelicals think. And so when someone talks about that, I'm able to understand it with compassion because that's what they understand it means to follow Jesus in this day and age.
Yeah.
And to be able to know that that can be held in the midst of grace, I think it's a wonderful thing. Most of the people that I work with, I think, are former evangelicals, former mainline, former traditional Catholic kind of spaces, or lived in those kind of places. But because I have that experience, I'm able to at least hear it and to be able to know that what they're feeling through some of the PTSD that goes on is very real. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's just simply holding space for people to process through what does that mean.
Yeah. So are you saying that spiritual directors are not spiritual authority? Is that how they should perceive spiritual directors?
I think that when it comes to different teachings about spiritual direction, I think sometimes the term spiritual direction can be deceiving because it makes it feel
Hmm.
like the quote unquote director is quote unquote directing where this person may be going. And historically, that was probably the ways that spiritual direction was. You had a confessor within a religious order who is then directing what the novitiates are supposed to be doing and living and believing. And so I think that's where the trend comes from. But the idea of spiritual companioning, I think, is much more in line with kind of where the field is today, because it's recognizing that a spiritual director, quote unquote director, is not directing. It's the Holy Spirit. It is that person's soul that is the one that is needing to kind of move forward. And so we really, a spiritual companion, is really kind of coming alongside someone so they can hear the directives of the divine that are speaking into their heart, to be able to help clear away the clutter so that they can hear more clearly what is going on within their own heart, within their own soul, within their own lives and their own lived experiences. So the director is not the director as much as really empowering the directee to really be the director of their own life, so to speak.
Hmm.
And for some people who really want to believe that I'm just simply following what the Spirit leads, I have no will of my own other than following God, well, then it's really helping them hear God leading them, the Spirit leading them as they are following faithfully. Whereas for other people who recognize that they've got more will to be able to kind of make decisions and so forth. And so it is really kind of listening into how how a person's experience of the divine is living out within their own spiritual life and trusting that the director, whether it is an external authority that's pressing upon them that they need to listen to and go, or whether it's more of an internal authority of where they're following, it's helping them listen to that and helping them be able to be faithful to that.
If you could name maybe one or two things that spiritual direction tends to address that other ministries or church ministry miss out on, or some things that fall through the crack, and then spiritual direction is there to catch it, what would that be?
People enter into a spiritual companioning relationship for different reasons. And so, in many ways, I think there are as many reasons to enter into spiritual direction as there are people. So, and so I think that there are some people that are simply looking for a safe space that they can simply talk about what is going on. And so I think the spiritual direction offers that for someone who simply needs a safe space because there's nowhere else that they really can simply be fully who they are. There's other people that enter into spiritual direction that are looking for something very specific to be able to work through. Not so much, is it like spiritual therapy? On some levels, there are times where someone is working through something and they need a spiritual director to be able to help them work through it. And so I think that becomes another thing that spiritual direction offers is the fact that it's not one size fits all. It's bringing what is going on with your soul to someone and trying to find a space where you can work through whatever that might be. I don't know if that fully answered your question, but I think there is a sense of having almost an individualized kind of opportunity to go through the spiritual journey with someone.
So another way to ask is like, it seems like spiritual direction is really needed. Who are looking for this type of safe space? So I guess I wanted to know the difference. What stands out about spiritual direction that we cannot often find in church community or church circle or in that kind of ministry?
I think that it kind of gets back to what we talked about a little bit earlier in regards to being able to ask questions or to be able to allow your true self to be able to show. There are a lot of ways that many people grow up, with this expectation of what it means to be a good Christian.
Hmm.
And so when you have doubts or you're struggling with your sexuality or your gender identity, you're wrestling with all those things that you're saying you're not supposed to, whether it's lust or greed or whatnot. You need to be able to have a place to be able to bring it to. As much as Protestant spaces say that they are safe, there's a lot of people who have been damaged because they've been told that it was safe and something was betrayed.
Hmm.
You look at some of the evangelical leaders that have fallen over the last 20, 30, 40 years who wrestled with whatnot, and it simply they just did not have a safe space to be able to talk about the things that eventually caused them to fall in regards to unfaithfulness and so forth. So people need a safe space. And I think the term spiritual direction sometimes can feel like this is it. But I
Yeah.
think that, as I said, spiritual direction is really about listening. So spiritual direction merges into this idea of pastoral counseling and all the other things that are there, but it creates that safe space for someone to be able to do that deeper soul work, recognizing that sometimes our souls need companioning. Our souls get lonely. Our souls get tired. Our souls need to be able to work through things with someone who is a trusted person. I mentioned that I've been meeting with my spiritual director for going on 20 years, and he knows me well enough. And so yesterday I said, I want to talk about this today. And I've not had an opportunity to talk it through and to wrestle through with it. And so we talked about it and we did this. And since he knows my journey, he was able to ask the questions in such a way that to be able to help pinpoint what my soul is trying to get to. And we need people who are skilled in asking questions and being able to know that the soul is trying to show itself. Parker Palmer says that the soul is frightened. The soul is like a scared little puppy. I don't think that's Parker Palmer's words, but it gets as though the soul is shy. The soul
Yeah.
doesn't want to show up, and the soul is only going to show up in safe spaces, and that takes time and it takes trust and it takes spiritual direction. And that's why I
Hmm.
think that spiritual direction becomes an important spiritual practice to be able to have a place where you can simply allow your soul to show up good, bad, ugly, struggling, wrestling. There are times when I've been with my spiritual director and he goes, I've not heard you sound like this for a long time. Able to reflect back those things because there is a sense that someone knows you on the journey.
How has becoming a spiritual director yourself changed you as a person?
And for I think a lot of spiritual directors, we work with what is called the Listening Collective at Rolling Ridge. It is our network of our spiritual directors community. It's people who've graduated from a variety of different spiritual direction programs. After you finish your program, oftentimes you're kind of off to kind of fend for yourself. If anyone's looking for a community, Rolling Ridge has this community of people who have finished up their spiritual direction programs, and we companion one another. It's a place to be able to ask questions, and it's a place to be able to be resourced and supported on the journey. But I know that when we have these conversations, oftentimes spiritual directors will say, it's like, I sometimes get more out of this than my directees do. Because God
Mm.
has this way of bringing people into into our Zoom screens or into our spaces where we meet with people who have an issue that we're going through, so that we're listening into their issue, kind of going, it's like, oh my gosh, this is almost like, I'm working through the same thing. God sometimes has this sense of humor to be able to allow us to be professionals who are able to companion someone and to put too much of ourselves into someone else's story, but to be able to hear someone else's story mirrored in our own things, which causes us to go, it's like, I need to talk to my spiritual director about this. And so in many ways, I've learned a lot as I listen to my spiritual directors work through the answers to the questions that I'm asking them as they're going through their stories, because some ways I have the same questions that I'm asking them. And so there's something about being open to the ways that the Spirit works in someone else's life that's also at work in my life, so that I can then be able to keep working on that stuff with my own spiritual director.
Mhm.
So as you know, as you probably share on your podcast, as a spiritual director who is helping in directing someone else, you as a spiritual director need your own spiritual director, while
Right.
also having supervision to be able to work through the issues that are coming up and working with your directees, while having your own spiritual director, so you can work on your own stuff and the ways that the Spirit is at work in your own life. And so I think for me, I found myself opened to the journey in ways that I might not have, because I'm hearing another person's perspective on something that I might also be going through. I think spiritual direction has also made me more compassionate, and in terms of where people are at, and to trust that even though I might see where someone might need to go, it's
Mhm.
not my role to be able to say that's where you need to go, but to be able to kind of help encourage them to be able to take the steps to be able to find their way. And I find it very encouraging that when I refrain from kind of doing the pastoral counseling thing and say, this is what you need to do, to be able to say, it's like nurturing them along to be able to keep on their journey. When a few sessions later, they're actually moving in the direction that I hoped they was moving, I'm going like, thank you, God. God is the one that really is the directing, and I need to be faithful to that. So it's allowed me to be more compassionate to the fact that God is at work in people, and it's really about the Spirit's own timing in someone else's life. And so, like, even when I work through my own issues with my own spiritual director that I was working through, to be able to kind of talk about this idea of the fact that God is at work, even though there are times when it's hard to feel it at the moment, and to be able to reflect on that with somebody else. And so for me, there is a sense of deeper compassion as I work with others, and as I also work on my own journey as well.
I believe that spiritual directors, because they do, as you said, it's all about listening, and they take time to listen to people in different journeys and all kinds of different struggles. So I feel like spiritual directors have very unique insight into the movement of the spirit in our era and within the movement of the church. So, what unique insight have you gained about church, like the whole entire movement of the church in this era? And what do you see as the biggest challenge going forward?
I have a unique opportunity at a retreat center to be able to, people come to us and they're looking for direction, and so we refer a lot of people out. But there are times when, there are particular things that kind of bump up my way that I kind of lean into. And so the people that I currently companion right now is I companion a Franciscan friar, I companion a Presbyterian pastor, I companion a UU pastor, and I'm just beginning to companion another UU pastor. So I kind of have this thing going on where I'm companioning those who are in full-time ordained ministry. I'm also companioning a former evangelical who is trying to find their way, and I'm also companioning a former traditional Catholic who is also trying to kind of find their way, and so it's a very unique thing where I'm companioning people who stake their livelihood in the institutional church, and I companion other people who don't want anything to do with the institutional church at
Mhm.
all. And so it's a very strange kind of place to be. And I think that on both sides of the coin, there is that common search for deeper meaning. I think that there are people who are in pastoral ministry who maybe not be as in tune to what is going on in their life, so that they might, so as much as they're leading the organization and whatnot, so much of their energy is going into leading the organization and trying to keep the churches from closing or whatever it needs to be, as opposed to those who are tending their work, recognizing that as much as I might have at stake within this institution, who I am as a person, as a beloved of God, is not found in this institution. It's found
Mhm.
in who I am as a created being, and who is holy and dearly loved by God. And so there is that deeper sense of meaning that I think that, those who are in the church, as well as those who are outside of the church, people who grew up evangelical and said that has nothing to do with me, who grew up traditionally Catholic, I don't want anything to do with that. It's also that search for meaning that they are looking for. And I think that for people, and I think we are at a day and age where people recognize that the institutional church is not going to help them answer that question at
Mhm.
all. I think that spiritual directors have a very important role to play, because our role is to be able to come alongside the soul.
Yes.
Our role is to be able to come alongside the heart and the mind and the bodies of people who are wondering, what is the deeper meaning of all of it? And for some people, they're going to stay within the context of a local church. But for others, they're going to be outside the local church trying to find that meaning in other places. What we do at our retreat center, we do a lot of online programming, and we do a book study on Richard Rohr, and we just had a book study just a few days ago, and someone was saying, it's like, this is the kind of community that I'm looking for, because if I bring up these questions about the Bible in my church, I know that someone's going to give me the evil eye. But they said, it's like, I'm glad that I've got a community where I can do
Mm.
that. And so even though it's not spiritual direction, there's a group spiritual direction that sometimes can take place in that. But it's just creating that safe space that people can be able to kind of to be able to kind of find that deeper meaning, to find their true self, to find that beloved self, to be able to know that they are loved no matter what, because God's love is unconditional. Period. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, and especially those who've grown up in the evangelical church who have decided to come out as out as LGBTQ, and all of a sudden, well, God loves you, but you have to deal with this part of it. Well, that's a but. What happened to unconditional love? Well, God still loves you unconditionally. And they try not to do a but there's automatically a but that comes out when all of a sudden you say, it's like, well, God does not love you because of something that is over here. And
Mm.
that is the hard thing for a lot of things, especially for those who hear the media where Christians are basically seen as judgmental people,
Mm.
period. And because of that, people are leaving church, or fleeing any message of the gospel, because it's being framed as that of judgment. and lack of integrity all the way around, you know. And so, I know that when it comes to like some of the former Catholics that I work with, they talk about the sex abuses within the Catholic Church, and it's just like, how can you support an entity that holds on to that? And yet it's so easy for people to take one thing and to be able to stereotype an entire institution about it and say, because of that, I want nothing to having to do with that. And that's where I think that, as we move into this next chapter, people have, it has been said that every 500 years the church goes through a rummage sale. The
Hmm.
church is going through a rummage sale right now, and church
Right.
as we know it right now is probably not going to exist in the next 5, 10, maybe 15 years, definitely within the next 100 years. Church is not going to be what it's looking like. Right now, I'm a part of Rolling Ridge, which is part of the Methodist Church, the United Methodist Church, the United Methodist split, and over the issue of related to LGBTQ. But the Methodists are now trying to figure out. It's like you have these more conservative Methodists that are going one direction. Now you have the United Methodists that are now holding the rest of the Methodist charism here in New England, but a lot of Methodist churches are graying out. Methodist churches are not going to look like what it used to.
Right.
Those nice little white steepled churches in the town square, those churches are going to be closing soon. And that is one of the things that the Methodists are wrestling through. The church
Yeah.
needs to re-look at what does it mean as a message of good news in terms of helping people know that they are loved and that they have meaning. And that's where I think that spiritual directors have more credibility than pastors do in society these days. Once upon a time, a local pastor could have great credibility within their community. Right now, people run away from pastors because all Christian pastors are clumped together, and it's like, oh, those Christians, I don't want anything to do with them.
Yeah.
Buddhists are actually very nice, and Muslims, I think we're starting to like them, but those
Yeah.
Christians, we need to stay away from them over there, even though the breed of Christians are all over the map, from very progressive, I've got a rainbow collar, to all the way to conservative of, I'm not going to use bad language, but it's like, telling people that they're going to, where kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And but it's all clumped together. So Christians automatically within the national context are not trusted at all. And that's where I think spiritual directors can step into that role to be able to help people hear the fact that there is a God that loves and embraces. And from the Christian perspective, there is an incarnate God that became flesh and blood to be able to tell people and to show people that God loves them. And it is really where it is really reframing the gospel message around how Jesus lived and not what the Bible has to say, but it's looking at the person of Jesus and how Jesus loved the people on the margins. But those nuances get missed in the larger narratives in our society
Hmm.
today.
Larry's also a professor at Merrimack College, so there's a lot of teaching points that just coming out, flowing out. I love it. So I'm glad that you mentioned the barometer sale. But for those of folks who don't know what he means by that, there's Phyllis Tickle talked about they're having a shift in about every 500 years or so, and so we are definitely identifying right now to be the time of transition. So like 500 years ago, we had Reformation, and another 500 years prior to that was a Great Schism and things of that nature. So we see the pattern of shifting taking place. And so we're definitely in that period where those of us who are paying attention to the history, we recognize that we're in the thick of the transitional period, confusing and things are changing and we don't know what it's going to be. So in this time of confusing, disorienting time, what would be your advice, Larry? Do do pastors become spiritual directors? Do they create spiritual directions, space for that, or do we kind of like just wander around in the desert? What is your recommendation in this time of shifting?
In this time of shifting, it's important for everybody to find their center. And so at Rolling Ridge, that is one of the phrases that we use. It's helping you find your center. I think everyone needs to find their center. And for some people, that center is going to be found within a local church and being able to grow in that center within the local church. For other people, it's going to be outside the local church. But I think that there is the need for everyone to be able to listen into what their unique and their divine call is. I think that for pastors who really have a gift for companioning and one-on-one, it's developing that sense of creating those spaces. I think it gets a little hard for pastors to also be spiritual directors because the lines of authority, so to speak, can get a little blurry. And so that's where it's many ways for people to kind of find what it is that they're being called to. There are a number of pastors that are leaving pastoral ministry and moving more into spiritual direction, but it's hard to make a living as a full-time spiritual director
Yeah.
kind of a thing. And that becomes another challenge as well about how to kind of lean into this. Because in many ways, spiritual direction, as much as people need to quote unquote make a living, spiritual directors are needed all over the place. And many people cannot afford a spiritual director. And so what does that mean then for people who need someone who's going to come alongside them, but cannot pay? And that's where in many ways within the local churches, you need to have the pastors that are there, but the churches might need to be able to have a network of spiritual directors that are available to be able to provide that safe and sacred space. The pastor can provide pastoral counseling. There might be a discipleship thing that's going on to be able to help people understand what are the tenets of faith to be able to live into and create more of an openness to be able to ask questions about that, but to be able to have an open space where anyone can come in and just say, I just need to talk with someone about what is stirring within my soul. And then for a spiritual director to be able to listen in and go, it's like, okay, let's listen into this. And then to be able to make a determination to, okay, well, maybe you really do need to see a pastoral counselor. Maybe you do need to see a therapist. Maybe you do need to be able to go into a Bible study and to be able to kind of be a clearinghouse is not the right word, but to be able to help listen into where the soul is at, where that person can help be better grounded in the place that they need to be. And so I don't necessarily know that fully answers your question, but I think that it's not going to be a one size fits all moving forward. It's going to be trusting that in the same way that when you have the various schisms, you have that have taken place, there's going to be another shift. There's going to be another change where another group may completely leave what is called the church to form something else. And what that something else is, I don't know. I know that when I talk to the person who teaches our spiritual direction program at Rolling Ridge, she says she thinks that the future of some of this is going to be housed in retreat centers because
Mm.
people feel more comfortable stepping into a retreat center than they do stepping into a local church. So how can retreat centers become those kind of places that people can be part of that journey? Because it's sometimes people step into a church and they don't know what they're going to find. And that's where, churches that have rainbow flags can at least alleviate some of that fear for someone who is concerned that if they come in and they are identifying as LGBTQ, at least they know that threshold is lowered. But I know that there are many people who see a rainbow flag, they walk in and they go, this is not a very welcoming place. In
Mm.
spite of the fact that there's a rainbow out there, there's something that needs to shift sometimes within cultures within the culture of a church to be able to create that welcoming, to be able to create that space that anyone can enter in and to be part of that journey. And so if churches are going to be able to make this transition, they really need to be able to consider, are they really welcoming spaces for everyone? And
Mm.
and of course, all churches are going to say, yes, we are. But the question is, are they really? And that's where, in many ways, they need to have, secret mystery diners going into their churches and to kind of give the like, no, this is not really,
Yeah.
not really
Right.
saying what, not doing what they are.
Yeah.
And
There's always a lot of like, yeah, you're welcome as long as,
as
and
long
then
as,
yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and they're always welcoming to their own people.
Since you talked about your retreat center for a little bit, how do people find you if they want to receive spiritual direction from you? And then, is that poster behind you, is that Rolling Ridge right
Oh
there?
yeah, so this is Rolling Ridge right here.
Yeah,
Where
so maybe tell us about how people can find you if they want to receive spiritual direction from you, and then maybe you can give us a little bit more, just a quick a shout out for your retreat center.
And so through what we call the Listening Collective at Rolling Ridge, we kind of curate our network of spiritual directors. And with that, we also have a I'm looking for a spiritual director network. We have a opportunity to be able to match someone who's looking for a spiritual director. We have an opportunity for our spiritual directors to kind of to be able to identify how they best can companion people on the journey. And so when someone is looking for a spiritual director, they're also ticking off what it is that they might be looking for to be able to help me and my team make a good match all the way around. And so, yes, we do a lot of work with a spiritual direction or helping people find a spiritual companion. But we do a lot of work at Rolling Ridge related to what we call contemplative spirituality, which is really what we talk about being wholly present, present with our whole being to the holy presence in everyone and everything. And so it's recognizing that as our center, our true selves, our soul is paying attention, our souls knows what it needs to be able to resonate where they sense the divine at work. And it's helping people to kind of get into those deeper contemplative spaces to be able to hear how God is at work, how the Spirit is at work, how the divine is at work in their life. We also have, and so along with our programs that we do, we also have our rental facilities. People can book and bring a group to our space. We're located on the shore of Lake Achikowit in North Andover. We're like Michigan. We're a little hand that sticks out in the lake, and so we're a historic property. Been a retreat house since 1948, and we survived the pandemic, and we're not going anywhere soon. Unlike unfortunately, some of the other retreat spaces in New England that needed to close, we continue to keep our vision forward about how to companion people on the journey. And so rollingridge.org, all one word, rollingridge.org is our website, and people can find out more information from there. So rollingridge.org, located in North Andover, Mass, just 35 miles north of Boston. You can make the drive in 40 minutes without traffic. With traffic, it all becomes a
Yeah.
whole nother question. So, but yeah, but we're here, but we serve the larger Boston area. Mentioned it is a United Methodist facility. I am not United Methodist. They brought me in to be able to expand the fold. I identify as what is called a Baptiscan, an American Baptist with a Franciscan heart, and
Hmm.
so between the Protestants and the Catholics and everything in between, from interfaith to interspirituality, we hold space for anyone who is looking for a companion to be able to help them find their center, listening in to what the divine is speaking to each person.
Thank you, Larry, for your time. I really enjoyed having conversation with you one on one, and then now on Zoom together. So thank you so much, and I really look forward to visiting again, having my own retreat at your place, and connecting with you more and more. So
Very good. Thanks,
yeah,
Dan.
thank
Okay.
you.